Welcome back to Simming History, where we look at the history of architecture through the lens of The Sims. Before we get started today, if you liked the video, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe. Today is the second in a series on Italian Renaissance architecture, and we're looking at Leon Battista Alberti and his Palazzo Rucellai. First off, we actually need to talk about a building that is not Alberti's, and that is because while Googling Palazzo Rucellai, you may stumble across a few sources citing photos that are not of Palazzo Rucellai. They're of the Palazzo Medici, also in Florence, but by Michelozzo. Palazzo Medici's construction began about 2 years before Palazzo Rucellai's, and there's actually quite a few differences, which we'll get into here shortly. What you need to know right now, as you venture into the World Wide Web, is if you have a shield with balls on it, those are oranges, and you're looking at the Medici family, not the Rucellai. Leon Battista Alberti was born in Genoa in 1404. He wasn't strictly an architect, but more of a scholar. He could read Latin and Greek. He studied at 2 separate universities, including law, and wrote a comedy in Latin that passed for a classical work for some time. In 1428, he traveled to Florence, where he met Brunelleschi and almost certainly Brunelleschi's compatriots Donatello and Ghiberti. And eventually, like Brunelleschi, he traveled to Rome to study the classical buildings, as you do. Brunelleschi, as we know, wanted to know how things were built from a structural perspective. That viewpoint ultimately led to him to build that dome. Alberti wanted to understand the rules dictating the art. He would return to Florence, where he would publish several works on art and architecture, most notably De Re Edificatoria, The Art of Building, the Renaissance's first architectural treatise, and the first major work on that subject since Vitruvius's own 10 books of architecture. All of these studies and theories, they culminated in Palazzo Rucellai. Begun sometime after 1446, the Palazzo Rucellai was built for the Rucellai family, who were merchants from Florence, whose seal was of depicted ships, not oranges, but who would eventually marry into the Medici family. Why Palazzo Rucellai is important is really the ways it is different from the Palazzo Medici, and thus the stylistic advances of Alberti. Both palazzos are 3 stories, but whereas Medici uses heavily rusticated stone on the ground floor, chiseled stone on the piano nobile, the first floor in Europe, the second floor in the United States, and smooth finished stone on the top floor, Rucellai has chiseled stone on all 3 floors, just in decreasing sizes. Each floor of Rucellai also has a full entablature, frieze and cornice, and not just cornice like at Medici. And this leads us to the orders. Medici does not use pilasters to define bays or corners, whereas Rucellai does. Even more importantly, however, is what those orders represent. Ground floor has Tuscan pilasters, the piano nobile has a stylized Corinthian, and the top floor a traditional Corinthian. Please note in The Sims, I've had to cheat and use Ionic for the piano nobile, because there just wasn't enough pilaster options even with custom content. Ironically, Tuscan, Ionic, Corinthian are the orders of the 3 levels of the Colosseum in Rome. Ironic because it is believed that the Colosseum may have served as an inspiration for Alberti for this application of orders. This is important, as this was the first time classical orders were applied in this way in the Renaissance, or even really since the classical era. And it would become the standard, using classical orders to define spaces and levels in the same way as the Romans. Which brings us to the bays. They have, the 2 palaces, essentially the same windows, but how those windows are organized are very different. At Medici, the piano nobile and top floor windows align, but are irregular in their spacing, and they don't align with the ground floor's arches or windows. As a result, there's a bit of a disconnect. Many visitors may not notice, but I guarantee you the architects do. Whereas at Rucellai, Alberti's use of the classical orders creates bays. These bays create regularity even when there are differences. The bays with the doors are just a bit wider than the bays with windows on the ground floor. These bays also create symmetry. The bays of Rucellai are laid out in an A, A, B, A, A, B, A, A pattern, with the far right A bay planned but never built. This sort of symmetry and regularity becomes a staple in the Renaissance architecture. And although the treatment of stone and its finishes adapts and changes during this period, Alberti's use of classical orders, bays, and symmetry really take hold. They become standard for all architects moving forward, which we're going to see over the rest of this series. And by the way, Alberti also designed a lot of churches, but we seriously cannot cover everything everyone did, or this series could be its own channel. I just don't have that kind of time. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure you hit like and subscribe. Thanks for joining me today. Until next time, you can find me on Instagram at Simming History, and on the Sims 4 gallery at Simming History will be playable versions of many of the builds on this channel. Thanks to all the new subs. If you haven't yet, hit subscribe. When we hit 1,000, I'll do a live build. So subscribe, share. I'll see you all next time. Until then, bye!